and welcome to the last but one Saturday Scholars of the season. Let me introduce Nina Glibetić, who is an assistant professor of liturgical studies here at Notre Dame. Her research area is in Christian liturgy in the pre-modern world, especially in the Christian East, and she is completing a monograph on the liturgy of medieval Slavs. Her work is very much interdisciplinary, and it pulls from multiple fields such as liturgical studies, theology, Byzantine studies, Slavic studies, and her research publications have explored topics on the development of Byzantine Eucharistic liturgy in the late Middle Ages, the role of liturgy in the formation of nationhood, medieval religious rites for women at childbirth and miscarriage, and the liturgical heritage of early Slavs. She's given lectures all across the world and held numerous research appointments. She was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and she's had fellowships at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, at Harvard, and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's currently a member of an international research team that is studying the extraordinary discovery of medieval manuscripts at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert on Mount Sinai in 1975. Please welcome Nina Glibetić.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're all well. You can hear me well. I can tell if I can hear my own voice. One thing to prepare you at, as you can tell, I'm in a specific physical state right now. And what that means is that my stomach is frequently pushing up on my lungs, so I might run out of breath. So just bear with me as I'm moving along. I'm very glad to be here with all of you. Okay. So the Sinai Peninsula represents the crossroads and land bridge between the world's two largest continents, Asia and Africa. And yet, despite this strategic position, it has always been sparsely populated, owing to its harsh desert landscape and arid climate. According to ancient tradition, it was in this region that the Israelites, in their exodus from Egypt, began their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before they reached the Promised Land. Yet nestled in the middle of this isolated and rugged mountain range lies one of the most significant sites of Christian heritage, the Monastery of St. Catherine. Today I invite you to explore the history and the treasures of this remarkable place. But first, a bit of introduction. Now, it is impossible to know exactly when the first Christians arrived to the Sinai, but it is evident from ancient sources that the peninsula was one of the first places of permanent monastic settlement. Inspired by St. Paul's admonition to pray without ceasing, and by Christ's example of prayer and fasting in the Judean desert, many early Christians sought out desert landscapes to abandon the worldly life and turn their attention exclusively to God. Now, for us in the US, we may not all have the same associations with the desert. On the contrary, in parts of American culture, the desert has even come to be associated as the epitome of worldly life, rendered more habitable by modern technology. Yet in the ancient world, deserts were very much the opposite, which is precisely why monks went there to devote themselves exclusively to prayer. Now, when we think of monks and nuns today, we typically associate them with monasteries, that is, buildings where communities of monastics live, pray, and work as a collective body. Many famous examples can come to mind, such as the great Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, or the medieval women's abbey of Nuremberg, popularized by the movie The Sound of Music. However, the earliest Christian monks of Egypt and Syria, they were hermits. They lived as solitaries in networks of caves and huts, such as these. In fact, the use of some of these ancient monastic caves continues in the Middle East and Europe to this day. And here is a couple of examples. By the early 4th century, many such hermits were living in the Sinai desert, and their choice of location was motivated principally by the Bible. Sinai was the place of God's call to Moses in the burning bush, hence a site of divine self-revelation. In the book of Exodus, God says to Moses, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." It is in the same context that God reveals himself to be a mystery when he describes himself as Yahweh, meaning I am who I am. Moses, obedient to God's requests, liberates the Israelites from their plight of slavery in Egypt and brings them to the Sinai, where God hands over the law. The law, of course, is the core of Israelite religious practice. For the Hebrew Bible, Sinai is one of the central settings of God's self-revelation, and the place where God manifests, reveals his intentions. This biblical association likely attracted some of the earliest monks to Sinai, for they sought knowledge and intimacy with God. Now, the 4th century historian Eusebius is the first historical witness to speak of Christian presence in the Sinai. He describes the pilgrimage of Saint Helena, who was a devout Christian and a mother of the famous Roman Emperor Constantine. According to Eusebius, Helena came to the Sinai around the year 326 as part of her Holy Land pilgrimage. Upon arrival, she discovered hermits living in caves in a valley associated with the burning bush. Now, moved by their faith, she built the first Christian permanent building in the area, a small chapel located at the purported site of the burning bush. Here you see it today. A few decades later, the monks also constructed a small chapel at the top of the adjacent mountain, on the spot tradition held to be where Moses received the commandments. And here it is, as it is today as well. Now, inspired by St. Helena, other Christians soon arrived to the region, usually as part of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. One such pilgrim left us a journal of her travels. Her name was Egeria, and she was either a nun or a wealthy woman from Spain that visited Sinai in the 4th century. Egeria's travelogue is one of the most famous early documents about pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And similar to the excitement with which people recount their travels abroad today, Egeria's journal captures Egeria's adventures. For example, about Sinai, she writes, "These mountains are ascended with infinite toil, for you cannot go up gently by a spiral track, but you climb straight up the whole way, as if by a wall. Thus the toil was great, for I had to go up on foot. And yet I did not feel it, because I realized that my desire was being fulfilled at God's bidding." Indeed, the archaeological evidence points to monastic settlements soon spreading throughout the area, even beyond Moses' mountain and the burning bush. They settled wherever there was a water basin, or a wadi, as the locals call it. By the 6th century, Sinai had become so important that the Byzantine Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodosia sponsored the construction of a large monastic compound at the base of Mount Moses, and they spared no expense. Their multi-building complex unfolded some of the older structures, and they built practical spaces for communal life, such as monastic cells and a refectory. Most importantly, they built a remarkable basilica, which they lavishly decorated. Justinian and Theodosia's entire complex was fortified by enormous walls, most of which are standing to this day. Their height varies between 30 to 60 feet, and they go up to an impressive 9 feet in thickness. And here you can see the original 6th century decorative crosses carved into the granite walls, the original Justinian walls. The imperial couple built the monastery as a fortress to protect the monks and to deter anyone who might think of raiding it. Their project held up to its purpose as the monastery stands to this day. St. Catherine's Monastery is considered to be a Byzantine monument. So I thought in a crowd like this that it might be helpful if I clarify how I'm using this term. Now here at Notre Dame, we are proud to have a robust Byzantine studies program. However, the word Byzantine, as we use it, is neither an ancient nor a medieval term, but a pure modern construct. Scholars use it to refer to the eastern part of the ancient Roman Empire, which survived after the western portion had collapsed, due in part to successive military incursions. While the Roman Empire fell in the west, the eastern half continued through several waves of expansion and contraction all the way until the 15th century. This is when the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, which is known today as Istanbul, fell to the Ottoman armies. So when we speak of the Byzantine Empire, we simply mean the Roman Empire as it continued and developed in the Eastern Mediterranean for a millennium after the fall of the empire in the West. The history of the Byzantine Empire is deeply intertwined with the history of Christianity in those territories, especially with what we know today as the Orthodox Church, either Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, maybe Bulgarian Orthodox, and others. Now, at the time that St. Catherine's was being expanded by Emperor Justinian, Byzantium was at one of its strongest points. The Byzantines had reconquered many territories, including several western provinces. Thus, the expansive construction of St. Catherine's, as it stands today, is in large part a legacy of the Byzantine Empire at its height. Yet only a century later, the Sinai, together with many of the eastern provinces, would be lost due to Arabic military conquests of much of the Middle East and North Africa. So it follows then that for most of its history, St. Catherine's has existed in Muslim-controlled lands, a political situation that continues to this day. Now, its survival is due both to the peacefulness of the monks and the respect they have enjoyed from the Muslim community. It is worth noting that the Quran itself refers to the biblical significance of Sinai, and Muslims regard the monks as honoring the common monotheistic reverence toward the site. According to a very old tradition, the monks actually met with the Prophet Muhammad, who declared that the monastery should be protected and exempt from all taxation in perpetuity. He then affixed his hand to a document that he dictated, and which affirmed the need for Muslims to protect not only the site, but Christians everywhere. The original is said to have been taken to Istanbul, but the monks proudly display a certified medieval copy of the document at the monastery to this day. So for this reason, even now, it is common to see both Muslim and Christian pilgrims, and Sinai has long been a site of interreligious tolerance, respect, and coexistence. So, as an ancient Byzantine monastery existing for centuries, St. Catherine's has amassed a renowned collection of religious and cultural treasures. Indeed, it is truly unparalleled in this regard. First, there is the monastic compound itself, together with its 6th century church, the oldest continuously used Byzantine church building in the world. The church has been the heart of this community for 1,500 years, as the setting where monks gather daily for hours of prayer. And here you can see the 6th century doorway with its original wood carving. The monastic day at the monastery typically begins around 4 a.m. when it is still dark outside. At this point, they chant their longest service, matins, as the sun gradually rises. Whenever I'm carrying out research at Sinai, I always attend these services, and it is quite impressive to start in complete darkness of the basilica and then gradually see the light illuminate the space and its fine artistic decoration. This photograph was taken. It's coming. This photograph was taken by one of the monks, Father Justin, who is originally from Texas. He took it just after the morning service, at the point when the sun fills the church from the east and when the basilica is its brightest. While much of the interior of the church has been restyled over the centuries, it also retains several original features, including the mosaic above the altar. This is one of the best preserved ancient apse decorations in the world. It offers a Christian interpretation of the Sinai by focusing in on a single New Testament episode, the Transfiguration of Christ. The episode tells of Christ taking 3 apostles, Peter, James, and John, to the top of a mountain. And here you can see much better the individual tesserae that make up the mosaic, so the ceramic and glass pieces used in the making of a mosaic. So on top of the mountain, Christ was transfigured, and his white garments shone like the sun. The mosaic captures the moment when Christ's divinity is revealed through his physical form. On his right and left, Christ is flanked by Moses and the prophet Elijah, whom the Bible also says spent time at Sinai. So together, these Old Testament figures represent the law and the prophets, that is, the core of ancient Judaism. Above, there are 2 additional images of Moses. In the first, he encounters God at the burning bush, and in the second, he receives the tablets of the law. By placing Christ's transfiguration at the center of their main chapel, the monks interpret Sinai as pointing toward Christ. The flame of the burning bush prefigures or announces the light of Christ's transfiguration, and both are moments of divine epiphany, divine self-revelation. Furthermore, just as God worked salvation for the Israelites on the Sinai, so Moses' appearance at Christ's transfiguration suggests that God's ultimate interaction with humanity is through Christ. But St. Catherine's is not only famous for this late antique mosaic, it also hosts the largest collection of Byzantine icons in the world. As some of you may know, in the Orthodox tradition, icons play an important role both in the liturgy, in the services, and in private devotion. And some of the most famous icons are actually at Sinai, such as this very well-known 6th century image of Christ. You're looking at an encaustic icon, meaning that it is painted with melted wax. Another encaustic icon from the same period is this image of the Virgin Mary holding Christ child, or this image of the Apostle Peter from the 7th century. Works such as these and many, many more make this remote spot in the desert one of the most important sites for historians of Christian art. And while some of the icons are displayed in the monastery's museum, Sinai is unique in that most of its historic icons continue to be in worship spaces, as they were originally intended, serving as visual aids for prayer. Now, in addition to all these artistic treasures, Sinai is also especially famous for its relics, and especially the body of St. Catherine of Alexandria. In fact, despite all the biblical associations with Sinai in popular speech, this men's monastery bears the name of a post-biblical female martyr. Now, just a question for people in the room. How many of you here are named Catherine or Kathy or Katie, Kathleen? Put your hand up high so I can see. Great. Okay, now keep your hands up for a second. And now, how many of you know people with those names? Great. Okay. Well, there are several famous Catherines in history, but the first is actually a martyr from Alexandria, Egypt, who lived at the turn of the 4th century during the last major persecution of Christians by the Roman state. Now, according to narratives of her life, Catherine was a highly educated woman at a time when Alexandria was one of the international centers of education. There, she taught others about Christianity and challenged the established religious traditions, which eventually led to her condemnation. Legend has it that the executioners attempted to kill Catherine by twisting her body around a spiked wheel. That's why you'll typically see her depicted holding a wheel, a spiked wheel. But when the wheel broke, they beheaded her, upon which milk flowed from her neck instead of blood. The feminine symbol of milk was associated with birth, and thus emblematic of her new birth in heaven post-martyrdom. Now, according to medieval narratives, around the year 800, monks uncovered Catherine's body and discovered it to be incorrupt and exuding richly fragrant oils. They eventually transferred her relics to the monastery church at Sinai. And in the Middle Ages, crusaders from Western Europe became especially devoted to her and flocked to venerate her relics. Several medieval texts emerge at the same time and discuss the many miracles that were worked through the fragrant oil stemming from her body, and these stories very much spread and multiplied in Europe. So these and other stories then of St. Catherine and her Sinai monastery widely inspired the medieval European imagination, hence the popularity of the name Catherine. In fact, scholars have documented that before the Crusader pilgrimages to the Holy Land, the name Catherine was virtually unknown in the West. Other famous Catherines of the Middle Ages, such as Catherine of Siena, were actually named after Catherine of Sinai. So anyone connected to the name Catherine, so basically all of you in this room, is in some way also linked to this medieval monastery. But perhaps, here just to show you Catherine's relics today at the monastery church. They're venerated each day at noon. They bring them up for pilgrims. Okay. But perhaps the most well-known of St. Catherine's treasures and the most connected to my own research are the manuscripts. St. Catherine preserves the oldest continuously existing library in the world, and the total collection is comprised of over 4,000 handwritten books, some of which are brilliantly illuminated. But it is not only impressive for its sheer quantity, but also because it contains some of the earliest examples of very important texts. Furthermore, it includes manuscripts written in a wide variety of languages, including Greek, Syriac, Arabic, Latin, Georgian, and Slavonic, among others. A linguistic diversity that reflects the diversity of monks and pilgrims, visitors to St. Catherine's over the centuries. And in fact, while it was mostly inhabited by Greek Christians, we know that monks from other parts of the world also lived at St. Catherine's at different times in history. So in many ways, the library is a striking testament to the international character of Christian presence in the Holy Land. Now, many of the ancient and medieval books at St. Catherine's are intimately connected to monastic life practice there. Hence, the library possesses numerous liturgical books, that is, books used for religious services, as well as manuscripts of the Bible or homilies and texts intended for spiritual edification. The collection also preserves works of ancient philosophy, literature, and medicine, revealing the broader interests of this international monastic community. But it was in May of 1975 that a sensational discovery took place at St. Catherine's. A monk named Sophronius accidentally uncovered a forgotten manuscript depository in a tower attached to the Justinian walls. His discovery took the scholarly community by a storm. It news just spread everywhere like lightning. Among the hundreds of fragments covered in dust and debris, Sophronius unearthed some of the oldest texts of the Sinai collection, including lost pages of one of the oldest Bibles in the world, the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus. Now, Sophronius' discovery is one of the reasons I was also drawn to the monastery. And here you can actually see the room where the manuscripts were discovered. Right, it was sort of just an abandoned space that they needed to renovate because the ceiling had collapsed. And so as they were renovating it, they just sort of stumbled on this depository of manuscripts. It's out of a movie. So this discovery is one of the reasons I too was drawn to the monastery. My main research specialization is the history of Eastern Christian liturgy in the Middle Ages. Essentially, I studied the prayer life and practices of Christians in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Now, we historians of the liturgy address questions such as, how did the Christian sacraments develop? How were Christian rituals the primary depository of theological expression? What did the prayer life of monks and laity look like across the centuries? How did liturgy accompany the lives of individuals and shape their relationship to the world? We study the development and transmission of texts and of religious and ritual texts, as well as the cultural contexts that surround these texts, as well as the intersecting artistic expressions, such as musical chant or sacred art and architecture, right? Because all things come together in the liturgical celebration, and you can't separate them if you want to get at sort of the entire experience. So essentially, we study what the practice of Christianity has looked like, sounded like, and what it signified, what it meant over the centuries and to this day. Now, before I move the slide, I just want to show, you maybe noticed how wonderfully clean we are. And this is Father Justin. This is the text that he's the head librarian of St. Catherine's. This is actually just after we sort of crawled up and visited this room, which explains the dust. Although you're partly always dusty in the desert, right, as you can imagine. See the flashlight because the lights were off. We were sort of crawling through to get to that room. Okay, so a place like Sinai is unique for the sheer quantity of liturgical sources it possesses, as these give us rich insight into the history of Christian prayer across the ages. Now, Sinai is also exceptional because its library possesses sources in a variety of languages, hence allows access to the history not only of Greek monks, but also of Christian peoples from different parts of the world through these texts. Now, for my own work, one fascinating aspect of St. Catherine's library concerns, of course, manuscripts copied by medieval Slavs. And some of the more elusive of these manuscripts are those written in an extremely rare alphabet known as Glagolitic. Have anybody heard of the name Glagolitic for a script? Okay, so there's some hands up. This alphabet was invented in the 9th century by two Greek monks that you may have already heard about, Saint Cyril and Methodius. How many people have heard about Cyril and Methodius? Right, yes. Now, to this day, many people mistakenly attribute the Cyrillic alphabet to Saint Cyril, right, which makes sense, of course. However, Cyrillic, the alphabet used throughout much of Eastern Europe today, is a later invention. It's also medieval, but it's later. Glagolitic was actually the first script of the Slavic peoples. And the early 11th century Glagolitic text that you're looking at is one of the oldest manuscript fragments written in the Slavonic language, which actually accidentally, by chance, discovered at St. Catherine's and recently published. Now, surprisingly, the Sinai collection has the largest number of Glagolitic texts in the world, and this has totally perplexed historians. The Glagolitic heritage had its home in southeastern Europe, and the use of this alphabet was believed to be isolated to that continent. So why then are the majority of extant Glagolitic texts held in the Middle East? Right. So together with a multidisciplinary team of scholars hosted at the University of Vienna, I'm helping, contributing in part to answering this question. For my own work, I'm studying the contents, especially the liturgical manuscripts, which are most of these are actually liturgical. I'm tracing the rituals and attempting to determine what traditions the earliest Slavic scribes were translating. So these are derivative texts. Most generally, we think of them as stemming from Greek sources, so Byzantine Greek liturgical practices and Roman practices, Western liturgical practices, right? And so Slavic texts are almost always translations, but at this period, liturgy wasn't fully standardized. So part of it is about determining what kind of liturgy are they translating, and this, of course, in turn tells us about the history of the people translating them, their geographic context, and also their Christian expression. But others on our team also include geneticists, computer software engineers, and language specialists. Our work includes the creation of software for reconstructing illegible texts. You can see kind of an example here, right? As well as DNA analysis of the animal skins that were used for making the manuscript, the parchment itself, and also even chemical an analysis of the chemicals of the plant dye used for the ink. And the hope is that when you pull all this data together, you'll have a stronger history or stronger case to make for a history of these sources, which in turn then helps you interpret them, right? So collectively, our work so far is suggesting that at least some of the Sinai Glagolitic manuscripts were copied on the Sinai by a group of Slavic monks that were living there. And this significantly colors our image of St. Catherine's as an international destination, not only for pilgrims, but also for permanent monastic residents. In the Middle Ages, St. Catherine's was a multilingual and multi-ethnic monastic center, and included Greek, Arabic, Georgian, and Slavic residents, among others. Previously, scholars didn't really associate the Holy Land with Slavs that early on in the 11th century. So it was something typically in the later Middle Ages, 13th, 14th century. So collectively, so indeed, as such, it must have also been a major place of cultural encounter and exchange. Another fascinating manuscript that we're currently studying is an 11th century liturgical book with no known parallels, known as the Sinai Missal. This manuscript, you can tell it's pretty heavily damaged. It's in sort of rough shape, but some pages are more legible than others. Now, this manuscript combines religious traditions of the Roman and Byzantine rites in a unique fashion, which testifies to the ways in which Sinai brought Christians together, even at times of increased estrangement between Christians of East and West, right? So this is a time of great tension between Byzantium and Rome that was sort of playing out in the Slavic context, but this manuscript shows liturgical traditions of both within one codex, which is extremely rare and testifying at a time of the unified church. Indeed, the Holy Land has long been recognized as a place that brings diverse Christians together. This is why Pope Paul VI and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras, famously met in Jerusalem when they mutually removed from memory the excommunications of the 11th century that had brought about the schism between the Roman and Eastern Orthodox churches. And in the aftermath of this meeting, Pope Paul VI asked the University of Notre Dame to continue this spirit of dialogue, which is why our university sponsors the Tantur Ecumenical Center in Jerusalem. It's actually right on the boundary between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, a place intended for Christian encounter and dialogue. The biblical, spiritual, literary, and artistic heritage of Sinai continues to make St. Catherine's Monastery a fascinating place even in the contemporary Middle East. The monastery plays a significant role in safeguarding the past and in continuing to foster the Christian monastic tradition in the Holy Land, despite the geopolitical shifts that have had devastating outcomes for Christian communities in that region. And just as its multilingual library reveals a community able to bring together Christians from across the globe, so St. Catherine's continues to serve as a beacon of ecumenical encounter. This center of Greek Orthodox monasticism welcomes Christian pilgrims from a variety of traditions, including local Egyptian Copts, as well as both Catholics and Protestants. Indeed, one of the most famous recent Catholic pilgrims to the region was Pope John Paul II, who for the millennium of the year 2000 went on a personal pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and despite his frail health, insisted on visiting St. Catherine's. Now, while today Sinai is part of Egypt, the harsh interior of this desert peninsula is largely organized into confederations of various Bedouin tribes, all of which are Muslim. And in the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, the overthrow of the Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak, Egypt went through a period of turmoil, and these Bedouin tribes had to adjust to the new political circumstances. In the far northeast Sinai, some Bedouins and other Egyptians aligned themselves with ISIS, setting off civil conflict with the Egyptian military that has only recently dissipated. Indeed, it was ISIS affiliates in the Sinai, you may have heard about this, who infamously brought down a Russian passenger jet in 2015 in revenge for Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. And as recently as 2017, an ISIS terrorist opened fire on Egyptian police stationed at a checkpoint near the monastery. But at the same time, the vast majority of Sinai Bedouins have remained fiercely loyal to St. Catherine's. This is especially the case for the tribe that lives closest to the monastery. Many of its families have been supporting and supported by the monastery over the centuries, and some are today employed by the monks. The same tribe even has a tradition that back in the 6th century, some of the construction workers brought by Emperor Justinian to build the monastery intermarried with locals and remained in the Sinai. I was once told by a local Bedouin that the Muslim Bedouins regard Orthodox pilgrims as distant cousins. So this is just one of the ways by which St. Catherine's Monastery continues to serve as a reminder of the peaceful coexistence, respect, and hospitality that can exist in the turbulent 21st century. In fact, most recently, the Sheikh Al-Thani from Qatar was so impressed by the religious coexistence at Sinai that he, as a Muslim, chose to make a large personal contribution toward the multi-million-dollar restoration of the apse mosaic of the Transfiguration of Christ in the main chapel. It's an enormous project. It took many years to complete. Now, gestures such as these are promising signs that the message of tolerance and respect that St. Catherine's represents is pushing through the regional tensions. And so on this note, I would like to close with a brief video clip about monastic life on Sinai. For it is one thing for me as a scholar to speak about the historical significance of the place, and it's very much another to let the monks speak for themselves about the meaning of Sinai. So let's give them the last word.
The culmination of the entire year at St. Catherine's Monastery is the joyous and light-filled celebration of the resurrection of Christ, the Feast of Feasts and the Festival of Festivals. The Greek word for this is Pascha, but this is known in the West as Easter. And it is one of the many times in which we are reminded that the treasures that we have here are a heritage that has been guarded by the vigilance of the fathers through the centuries gone by, and that we continue in that heritage because of their labors.
And they are the world's inheritance. And we have the responsibility to protect and conserve them, as we have done to this day. throughout the ages, for as long as the centuries exist.
Of all the icons that survive in the world from Byzantine times, over half of them are at St. Catherine's Monastery. It is very humbling to be surrounded at every service by these glorious and beautiful icons. Standing in the basilica that has stood since the year 550 and chanting the same services and the same hymns, the way of life here is very much the ancient way of life that has been pursued here for many, many centuries. Icons are not simply works of art. They were created in prayer, and they find their fulfillment in prayer and in worship. And it is a very beautiful thing to see icons in the services. They seem to come to life with the lights, candles, with the incense, and the lamps that are lit in front of the icons. And the entire service, both the vestments, the hymns, the icons, it becomes a seamless whole. And it is an entering into the scriptural world. At the beginning and the middle and the end of every day, we have the services which form the anchor to each day.
Είναι η προσευχή, έτσι μπορούμε να πούμε.
One could say that prayer is the blossom of the life in Christ, and like a tree, in order to bear fruit, it needs to blossom first.
Το κύριο έργο του μοναχού είναι η προσευχή.
The primary occupation of a monk is prayer. But in order to not live at the expense of others, it is necessary for him to work in the monastery. What we call diakonima, daily tasks. One works in the library, one goes down to the church, another works in the garden. That way each one does what he can.
Today, this place is respected by both Christians and Jews. It is accepted also by the Muslims who recognize it in the Quran as the place where Moses received the Ten Commandments. So this place is recognized and honored by the three largest monotheistic religions. I have had the joy, I will not say luck, because it was an obvious choice, to have been at this monastery since 1961. And so I have been living here for about 45 years, since I arrived as a young man. There have been many changes here in that time. In today's world, we have grown more and more involved with ourselves and our material possessions. It is what we now call globalization. I wish that word meant the global rebirth and renewal of the spirit. Unfortunately, it does not seem to. We would be a whole lot happier if it did. This is what we try to do here, to give life to that other meaning.